Over the last few years, I've been learning to tell stories about trees and landscapes in central Italy. These are landscapes that have been cultivated by humans for several thousand years. As in so many parts of the world, traces of former human use are omnipresent if you pay attention. Ancient cultivated trees, old terraces, abandoned houses, drainage channels, traces of human presence are everywhere. My method is to walk slowly, to look closely at the details of tree and landscape form. Noticing gives rise to wondering, as I imagine the histories of encounters with forest fires, plant diseases, peasant firewood cutters, which give each individual tree its own particular morphology, its form. I wonder why each terrace was built. I look out across the landscape and try to imagine the processes which shaped it. So I take notes, photographs, I sketch particularly interesting trees. This kind of speculative noticing is a way of looking not only for the effects of humans upon trees and landscapes, but for the effects of non-humans upon each other. The biography of trees is recorded in their forms as they respond to these encounters with other beings: fire, disease, drought, disease, climate change, the whole 9 yards. Tree branches grow towards light, roots grow in response to soil, to moisture, to human care. So this kind of walking, noticing, and speculating is a kind of way of being pulled into telling stories about the past and futures of landscapes, and of learning to be alert to surprises. This kind of speculative noticing is how many natural scientists come up with the questions that drive their research. The peasants and indigenous people have always done this too. The farmers I talked to in Italy and the Zapotec indigenous people I worked with in Mexico have always noticed and wondered. So in what follows today, I'm going to describe how I go about learning to notice, with the hope that this will persuade you that you have already been doing this kind of speculative noticing in your daily life, in your travels through the world all along. Second, I'm going to argue that speculative noticing can literally rewire your senses. And then finally, I'm going to suggest that once your senses are rewired in this way, you will come up with stories about the strange histories of plants, soils, and stones. These stories are accountable to your experiences of coming into noticing. These kinds of stories are passionate, engaged, but also, I hope, humble and a bit uncertain. Let me tell you some... how do I do this? Yeah, that'll do. Let me tell you about how I came to tell stories that emerged from noticing tree stumps in the forest. So this is my collaborator botanist Francesco Roma Marzio standing with an ancient chestnut stump. It looks rather anonymous, although it's rather large, but its shape, its morphology contains an entire history. So imagine that it's big. These stumps mark histories of firewood cutting, people growing full-size branches to use for firewood or maybe for construction. The larger stump was an ancient cultivated chestnut tree, which was the basis of an entire civilization in this part of the world. Right? It was used to produce food over many, many centuries. So I'll tell you what you're looking at. This is a very well-maintained selva, or chestnut orchard in the high Apennines. It's about 25 kilometers north of Lucca. It's central Italy. The trees are nicely spaced out to favor fruit production. They're about 200 years old. They're very well cared for. None of them have got shoots at their base, not even any suckers, right? And there's a system of walls around many of them. They're called lunette. They're used to trap soil, to keep the roots covered in soil, to keep the trees happy. And finally, the whole orchard is clear and relatively grassy. That requires work of sheep and goats who graze, and of a farmer who comes in and rakes up the leaves and burrs and burns them every year. So what you can't see in this picture, but I can, is the scars, the presence of graft scars, which are the physical manifestation of the long ago moment when a peasant farmer grafted a desired domestic variety onto a wild rootstock called the porta innesto. I actually can't see all the graft scars, but I know sort of where to look. About here, it depends. So the scar is present in the bark, and if you know where to look, you can see the sign. It's like a wave front that emerges from the disturbance of the moment of grafting decades or centuries ago. It requires this amazing tactile skill and imagination in the moment of grafting, where you line up the cambium layer of the shoot and the rootstock. They have to be lined up literally at the level of 5 or 10 cells of thickness in the cambium layer, or the graft won't take, right? So there's a moment of sensitivity and attunement. Trees, fire, people, soils, grass, and sheep have affected each other. So I hope I persuade you that trees are fairly wild creatures. They can change shape from this to this, right? The morphological inventiveness of plants and trees is really spectacular. To notice plant form is to open yourself up to notice the slow, sly, strange shape-changing practices of trees. And that's why I call my next picture my chestnut bestiary. Same species, different shape. This is just after it's cut. It has a special word for it, ceppo or loni. This is 20 years after. It's called coppice in English, cedro in Italian. It could be good for firewood. You might use poles. 30 years later, it's singled back and it's called vernacchia. And then 200 years old later, if it's grafted, the graft bulge is kind of sort of there. It has named varieties for the 80, 90 varieties of cultivated chestnut, but the wild rootstock is there. And the whole assemblage requires continuing care. So trees are crazy. They do wild things. And if you look at their form, you begin to see them as shape-changing creatures moving slowly through time. I'll just say one more thing about the terraces, seeing as I have time. One of them is that I didn't know we were going to talk about soils, but terraces emerge because peasant farmers care about the flourishing of plants. Plants sense soil way better than people. Peasants notice the plant roots moving into soil and trees responding to soil. And terrace building literally emerges through us noticing plants, noticing something else that we are imperfectly able to sense. So the sensing capacities of plants have driven terrace building right across the Mediterranean. So that's a large impact upon the landscape. Yeah. Another way of making ourselves notice the signs of plant-human-soil relations is to talk to others, peasant farmers as I do, but also to dead people. The way I talk to dead people is I look at the legal and tax documents in the Archivio di Stato of the city of Lucca, searching for glimpses of changing human, non-human relations. Sometimes an old document will alert me to surprising details of landscape change and lead to the rewiring of my senses. So as long ago as the 2nd century BCE, we know that cultivation of trees was supporting vines in various complicated systems. This beautiful relief is from the facade of the Cathedral of Lucca. It's March and the peasant is doing the work of the season, grafting grapevines that are growing upon a heavily pruned tree. Right? This kind of cultivation was known as vite maritata, and it was used to divide up the landscape into cultivated terraces, closed fields, or sometimes irrigated pastures. So this image from the archive, much more recent actually, from about 1820, shows something quite similar. These are poplar trees, which have been pruned to have side branches that sustain festoons of grapevines. This is a canal, and this is the canal bank. So imagine this as the coordination of many rhythms, the movement of water, the slower but still there is movement of soil, there is the growth of the tree, and then there are the vines. And all of this requires intense care by peasants or by others who come in to kind of keep these things more or less working with each other. It's a kind of fragile choreography. The poplar can grow too quickly, the vine can take over, right? This beautiful and haunting image, which I stumbled across in the archive, made me remember something I knew but had allowed myself to forget. When I was a teenager, there were still many ancient field maples with remnant branches sustaining vines and fields. This is in Italy. Most are gone now. This is a tiny fragment that I went looking for and triumphantly found. Maybe you can't see it, but it's actually pear trees with grapevines growing on them next to somebody's house in Lucca in 2016. On a chance, I returned to the location of that beautiful 18th century line drawing I just showed you to see if anything remained of this precarious choreography of human, soil, water, poplar, vine. And what I found there was something like an out-of-control jungle. The poplars were there and the vines were there, but the peasants were gone, or at least they weren't doing the work anymore. The vines were growing wild across the trees in the searing summer heat. And here you see the sudden emergence I tried to show you in this flaming hot pink, when I suddenly realized that the poplar trees, the vines are still there but gone wild, right? And It's a moment when my senses became attuned to the particular glossy green of grape leaves, right? Just as the drawing from the archive woke my memory, the encounter with the wild vines woke my senses. Once your senses are attuned and awakened to a particular pattern, texture, and color, it's very hard or almost impossible to switch them off again. So in car parks, near supermarkets, my assistant Fabio and I could not stop seeing grapevines running wild across the former peasant landscapes that had become wild suburban land. This is just nowhere, really. It's just the subdivisions of suburbia. I tried to make it as banal as possible because that's where you notice these remnant rhythms of cultivation. I tell this story to show you how your senses can be transformed by moving back and forth between archives, talking to experts, and re-entering landscapes and using your curiosity. In the end, you have to learn to notice what is in front of you, to see a parking lot as the trace of centuries of peasant vine and tree care. Telling stories that come from your senses. Sometimes anthropologists and social scientists are reluctant to trust our senses. We might think that our job is to focus on the stories people tell us rather than on our own capacity to notice details about the world and to tell the stories that these details inspire. Certainly, I do plenty of listening to other people's stories. I learned to recognize ancient chestnut trees, and specifically grass, by talking to farmers. Learning from others does not, however, absolve me from continuing to notice, to speculate, to wonder, to try to detect patterns across the landscape and to tell stories about these patterns. In other words, when all is said and done, you still have to trust your senses and your capacity to speculate about the forces that shaped a particular tree, a branch, a riverbank, or a mountainside. In telling you a little bit about how the histories of human, animal, plant interaction shape the forms of trees and landscapes in Italy, I hope I've inspired you to notice the shape-changing capacities of trees in your own daily lives. If you look closely, traces of former human cultivation and care, or present cultivation, are everywhere around you, from the most apparently mundane street trees to the remnants of ancient cultivation which stay on in the interstices of modern cities. I was looking hard when I came into Calgary, and I've been walking around, but I don't know the grasses very well, but I have some preliminary thoughts, right? At the University of California in Santa Cruz, where I teach, the campus is laden with histories of predatory capitalist logging in the late 19th century. Coastal live oaks at the edges of meadows are likely holdovers from the oak savannas produced by controlled burning by Amamuts and Native American people. And perhaps, and I'm sure this is the case, but I know too little to say exactly how, I imagine that similar histories of First Nation care are present in the forms of grasslands, trees, and pastures in and around Calgary. And I would love to talk more about that. Today I've talked about how we might come to be partially attuned to the strangeness of long-lived beings that live at a very different pace from us. To become attuned to the temporal rhythms of trees is to notice their gestures as they sense processes invisible to us. So think soils, think water, and think climate change. We depend upon the sensing capacities of plants that notice things that we can't notice, or we notice very badly. One of the earliest soil handbooks that's still in existence, Columella, writing in sort of 1st century AD, says the best way to figure out where to plant things is to notice the plants that are already growing there and use them as a sign to the quality of the soils. This is basic stuff. I grow things in my garden that seem to be doing well in the gardens of my neighbors, obviously. I find it hopeful that the slowness of trees makes us notice and act for the relatively long term. Consider this ancient chestnut tree, high up in the Italian Apennine Mountains, grafted perhaps 600 years ago by peasant cultivators. In the mountains of the Mediterranean, the most ancient trees are grafted chestnut trees. So this, I'm going to tell you what you're looking at. So this amazing kind of bulge sculpted form is actually the echo of the grass scar 600 years later, which is a beautiful thought to think with. These loops here and here and here are where side shoots came out, and the peasant farmer who was responsible for the tree came by and pruned them off. There's a couple of new shoots here, but it won't kill the tree yet. The main stem is the cultivated variety. If the side shoots are not taken off, the main shoot will die, and it will change its shape. The tree will be fine, to be clear, but the shape of the tree will change. This ancient tree therefore shows not only past cultivation but ongoing care. And it's a kind of tremendously persuasive evidence of human-plant communication, because a tree for 600 years has coaxed human beings to come by every 15 or 20 years to do the required care to keep this precarious assemblage going, right? So this is literally a physical demonstration of a rather efficacious, long-term, although unstable relationship. I find that hopeful for our times. The morphology of trees places a call upon us to respond, to be responsible, and to care for them, and to move through time with very long-term creatures when we are more concerned with short time. So today I've described how we can come to be passionately concerned with the strange, slow-lived beings which surround us, from trees to rivers to stones. I would have talked about terraces, but that wasn't the talk today. I can talk about terraces and rivers. These beings compel us, they call us to account, and they transform us, as when I come to notice grapevines running wild across abandoned fields. Once you notice, you can't stop noticing. The stories we tell about the past and the possible futures are a response to these beings. Such stories help us step aside from the stories of progress and environmental apocalypse that we are too often pulled into. Learning to notice the slow rhythms of trees presses me to tell stories about the past and the future. This is a demanding relationship where storytelling is a matter of responding and of being responsible. The story has to be as right as I can get it. I have to respond to the obligation of the encounter and to the humans and non-humans who brought me there. These are stories that I feel I have to tell, even while I also know that each story is partial, limited, and provisional. It therefore seems fitting to end with some element of doubt. I can tell stories about this tree, but I never really fully know what it is or might become. And the reason I say this is that as a forester, I know that trees often surprise you. Just when you think they're dead, they come back alive, and you think it's just fine, and it dies. And there's an element of surprise. And then they're shape changers as well. They're fantastic creatures. Did I put it in? I didn't. Okay. This tree, in a certain sense, is unstable. It's always coming apart but holding itself together. I've described it as being a certain kind of being, but it could be something else, right? Just in the time period of its existence, this tree has been a food source for peasants, a source of tannin for a nearby factory. Well, the factory didn't get to cut the tree down, but it would have liked to. An object of care for environmentalists concerned with local heritage. The odds are the tree will outlast all of the things that we have to say about it into another era entirely, or at least I hope so. I find it helpful then to remain passionately empirical, to remember that all of my perceptions, my descriptions and stories fail to fully capture what I describe. And this, of course, is all the more the case because as a very passionate person who gets excited about what I notice, I have to remind myself that other stories are possible. Thank you.
Was there a moment, Andrew, tell me about the moment or a moment where you started looking at trees differently? And can you boil that back? Because you've obviously, it would take you like 3 hours to walk down a street. That's quite obvious. But was there a moment?
Yes, like most of us, it's childhood, right? My grandmother's land in Italy, walking around. But I didn't grow up knowing the names for all these trees because I lived in the Middle East as a child. I used to read books describing European landscapes and say, these weird Europeans, they seem to know the names for all these trees. But Kuwait had 2 species of tree. So I had to learn my science later, right? But I've been walking around and looking at trees and landscapes more or less obsessively since I was a child.
And when you see, I'm taken with the notion, I think some of us were, with the notion of scarring. Is there judgment or moral attachment to that? That scar was a negative that is 600 years later still there? Or is it neutral in your mind? How do you look at that?
I would go with ambiguous. And I'm really glad you answered that question. This is very loud. Can I just use my voice?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would just say that a graft is really interesting because in nature, the places where we find grafts are actually with encounters between tree roots. And tree roots allow trees to share nutrients to some degree with each other, including a cross-species difference. So I've been thinking of the above-ground relations of peasants with chestnut trees as being like a different kind of interspecies sharing of energy, comparable perhaps to the underground grafting nutrient-sharing relationship. That's positive. On the negative side, grafts are a site for diseases to enter, and both above and below ground you can have pathogens spreading through grafting, right? So both, right? Yeah.
Precarious choreography. It's a great name for a band. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Mathews.